pornographic and nothing explicit. So we have observed over the year an increase in the number of video games portraying the life of queer folks. And this is something we see from the 1980s up till today, and that has been quite well documented in the LGBTQ video game archive. That being said, despite the rising number of video games portraying the life of queer folks, and despite the rising number of queer folks in video games, these characters continue to be tragically framed. As Heather Alexandra puts it, quote, while games allow us to be many things, space marines, mages, and tenacious heroes, they rarely allow queer people to be happy, end of the quote. Some games go further than others in employing the now infamous bury your gays trope. And so I put some example on this slide, which are all taken from Heather Alexandra's paper. So on the top right, we have Ellie and Riley from The Last of Us Left Behind, who share a kiss and end up being attacked by infected. They both get bitten and Riley dies. On the top left, there's Carl Tekla and Anders, and in Dragon Age 2, and Anders end up killing Carl Tekla, his ex-lover, whose mind has been magically lobotomized. And on the bottom, we also have Max and Chloe. And so Max falls in love with Chloe in Life is Strange. And throughout the game, Chloe can die in countless ways, the most memorable one probably being at the end of the game, sacrificing herself to save Arcadia Bay from a hurricane. So as these examples show, in the world of video games, experiencing a happy ending is not something that is allowed to everyone. In contrast with these games, we have Coming Out on Top, which is a gay team dating simulator and visual novel developed in 2014 by Obscurasoft. And this visual novel follows the convention of the comedy genre. The game tells the story of Mark Matthews, a college student who recently made his coming out, and centered on his last academic year, his friendship with his two roommates, and his romantic and sexual life. The main storyline allows the player to date 6 characters, which are called love interests in the game, and to hook up with 12 additional characters through the Brofinder dating app. The game is a mix of situational, romantic, and gross-out comedy, and contain erotic and pornographic material, notably pictures of the protagonist having sex with other characters. So, although Coming Out on Top reinforces the idea of consumable gay male bodies and clearly lack body diversity, so this is something that has been brought up by Todd or Harper, and I really agree with this analysis of the game. But this is not what I will be focusing on in this paper. What interests me in this paper is a qualitative analysis that I conducted on Steam. So I played the game myself, and then out of curiosity, I went on Steam to have a look at some reviews. This is how this project started. And I was very surprised by how positive the reviews were. Players described the game as funny and fun to play, and as full of love and sexy scenes, and usually want the best for the game characters. So 2 elements seem to stand out from the game. Its humor and its sexual content. And one player even emphasized how both go very well together. So I decided to look more at sexual humor in the game. Studies on that topic are still scarce. I would say I put some example here, and they are even more scarce when it comes to sexual humor in games with LGBT plus content. These games usually will focus on the politics of representation instead. So I believe that humor can be used to create a safe environment and can be a powerful tool to explore sexuality, including that of marginalized folks. As noted by Poso, quote, focusing on the humor in pornography draws critical attention away from pornography's visual style, allowing for an understanding of porn within its narrative and reception context, end of the quote. So with that in mind, I analyzed in this paper sexual humor in Coming Out on Top, and I argued that the game mostly leaves a positive impression on queer players because it offers them something relatively new in the world of video games, which is the possibility to laugh and to imagine their lives in a positive and fun way. So quickly for the theoretical framework, my reflection finds its origin in the concept of affordance. So this concept has been defined in many ways, but I was mostly interested in the work of Greer and Krobova and all, who have transposed this term to the medium of video games and explored what the world of video games offer queer players. And so I was mostly interested in what Coming Out on Top offer gay men gay men, since they are the target audience of the game, and I was looking at that in terms of gameplay and narrative possibility. I used ethnography as a starting point and proceeded to the analysis of 514 reviews on Steam. I used applied thematic analysis, and I was trying to answer this very broad and very exploratory research question. So, what do players like or dislike about coming out on top? And then I was trying to create a dialogue between my own gaming experience, the experience of these players, and current scholarship and previous scholarship on humor. And so I was interpreting this data in light of the incongruity theory, which states that people laugh at things that are surprising or unexpected. So we can think about that as, humor that plays with different frames of reference, multiple meanings, ambiguity, association. But before I look at the humor in Coming Out on Top more precisely, I want to talk about it a bit more in relation to genre conventions. So, like I mentioned, Coming Out on Top is a visual novel and a dating simulator. I like to see it as a hybrid game, especially since these two genres both come originally from Japan and often come hand in hand. What is interesting with hybrid games like Coming Out on Top is that they are still the main venue for erotic and pornographic content in game culture. At the same time, most visual novels and dating simulator are quite heteronormative. The, the type of dating simulator that we see the most is probably Bizzocchi games, which are these games in which the player plays as a straight man interacting with attractive girls with the goal of ending in a relationship with one or many of them. And so Taylor has argued that female characters in these games are rather weak and tend to be presented as shoujo or girls, although they are women. They are cute, they are emotional, and they are sexually inexperienced. Along the same line, Patrick Galbraith has pointed out that in these games, the assumed straight male player is the one who is making a choice, deciding with who he wants to end up in a relationship with, whereas the female characters are objects to be acted upon. So I think it's interesting to compare Coming Out on Top with these games, and especially because since the 2010 we have all these visual novels and dating simulators that are coming out that are targeted at gay men quite explicitly, with all these characters, these very beefy character, I would say. And so I would argue that this is what Sivonen and Stenros have called queering the artifact. So in these games, we have queer narrative, we have these games that push players toward queer performance, leading them to date other men, fantasize about them, have sex with them, and ultimately to subvert the convention of Bishoujo games. So in these games, these games break with taboos around homosexuality and sex, and especially around the two together, gay sex. And I think it's interesting to read them in the context of heteronormative societal norm and of a heteronormative game culture as a form of gaming against the grain. So now to go back to sexual humor, what did player like about Coming Out on Top? Well, they like many things. They like the storyline and the dialogues, they like the characters, they like the theme song, they like the fact that there's queer content available on Steam, many things. And these things seems rather broad, but I would argue that ultimately they are all related to humor and sex. And this is something that Carulahti and Bonello Rutter Giappone have also observed in the Laser Suit Larry series in a paper that is still in press. And they argued that in Laser Suit Larry, everything is potentially sexualized and or turned into a joke. And imagining the game without these teams structuring its story and its gameplay is rather difficult. And so I would argue that it's pretty much the same thing that is going on in Coming Out on Top. So now I will talk about some specific moment in the game and humor in relation to that. So first, in Coming Out on Top, we have implicit sexual humor. And so in the example that I'm going to present, so we have Mark on the top left, who's about to help Brad because Brad doesn't understand how to write an essay, So he's his tutor, and so I'm going to show. Yeah. So okay. So Brad complained, why should I organize my asset this way? It's so stupid. And so Mark is explaining him. And if I, as the player, you pay attention to what is going on, then you're gonna decipher what is really going on, what Mark is implying by in his explanation. So Mark says, well, you have to write your essay this way, well, because you want to drive your point home. Yeah, but first you have to ease into it. Slowly at first, let the reader get used to you, get a chance to adjust. And of course, Brad is repeating everything in between. And then Mark says, then when the reader has cut his breath, start pounding it in. You want him gasping for breath, grabbing his ankle, panting in your ear, blah, blah. It goes on. So, it becomes quite obvious that this is a description of a rough anal intercourse. But when you're the player playing the game and you have, you click on the left button on the mouse and you see one sentence at a time, you really have to pay attention to this humor. And I would argue that this humor is like a form of puzzle. You have to decipher the humor. And once you have managed to do so, it leads to a aha effect that is somehow, yeah, that is reminiscent of the act of solving a puzzle. And it creates this complicity between the game and between the player. And so, as Carolatti and Bonello Richard Giappone have observed in relation again to the Laser Suit Larry series, the end of a joke and its resolution is followed by a satisfaction that can be compared to sexual climax. And although this can be seen, this is maybe a bit of a stretch for some people, but I think it's interesting to think about that in the case of coming out on top and in the case of games that are very pornographic. I think there is this relationship between humor and pornography that is interesting to explore. Freud has also highlighted or argued that the build-up to laughter and the use of tendentious jokes more specifically, so jokes that are hostile or obscene and that bypass taboo, allows for the satisfaction of a drive. And so in this case, the joke can be seen as allowing both Mark and the player, who might as well be fencing Brad, to express their sexual desire for Brad and transgress social taboos surrounding gay sex, offering them a form of release. And so while slower paced conversation like that are effective to tell implicit sexual jokes, arouse the curiosity of the player, push them to pay attention to the double meaning of each sentences. We also have, in coming out on top, dialogue trees. And dialogue trees is something that we see in visual novels quite often. So, usually the player will have to answer something to another player or make a decision. And so the many options will pop up on the screen. And so in coming out on top, this is used to tell jokes also. And so in one scene, Mark is having an erotic dream involving his anatomy professor. And of course, they are both having sex in his dream. And so Jan enters in Mark's room. So Mark's wake up and says, oh, what a dream. And Jan asks him what the dream was about. And so as the player, you can answer your mom, you, my anatomy professor, or nothing, nothing at all. And I mean, if you read the answer by yourself, you'll see that it's quite vulgar. And so what is interesting here is that the dialogue trees are used to tell many jokes at the same time. And the humor here it's very hard to describe, but it's more abrupt. When I played that part of the game for the first time, I burst out laughing. The feeling you experience is really not the same as in the other example I gave. And so what is interesting here is that you can tell many jokes at the same time. You can build the personality of the characters very quickly as well. This is something I'm taking from Ron Gilbert. And so even if as the player you don't pick any of these crude answer, if you're like me and you're shy even when you play a game and you answer nothing, nothing at all, I don't remember, like I did, well, but you still see all these other answers and can have a good laugh. The last element I would like to talk about are side gags. So as I said, in coming out on top, everything is comic, everything is turned into a joke, with the exception of sex scenes. Sex scenes are depicted in a way that is very teasing, very sexually arousing for the player, and it reproduces the aesthetic of hardcore pornography. So since most of the sex scenes are so serious, the scenes that are turned into a joke come as even more surprising. And so in one segment of the game, which is a fan favorite, Marks fall in love with his goldfish. And in the most improbable way, they end up having sex. And so just thinking about that is kind of funny, but in the game, we even get a picture of it. And so here the comic aspect lies in the juxtaposition of two incompatible interpretations. a human and a fish, and at the same time a loving couple. A sex scene that is ridiculous and absurd, but that is also depicted seriously and pornographically, just like all the other sex scenes of the game. And so, moving closer to my conclusion, I would argue that the humor in coming out on top is important because the game puts so much emphasis on sex. So it is a way to build the characters, contributes to their development, it gives them a certain charm, and it leads players to have preference for some characters over others. So it allows for socio-emotional interaction with between the game characters, but also between the player and the game characters. And this is something we see when we look the reviews on Steam. We have all these players giving these very specific anecdotes about the game, talking about how they ended up saving their anatomy professor from an evil conspiracy, or how they started to play the game because of the sexual content, but in the end finished the game many times because they really like Brad. So I would say that humor allows to build these characters and avoid falling with while having them built exclusively according to a psychology of lust. These characters become likable or even lovable, and more than mere sex objects. So to conclude, like many players, the memories I have of coming out on top are mostly positive. Coming out on top is the first game that allowed me to freely live and express my sexuality in the virtual world, and to experience through my avatar desires and emotional and physical intimacy with characters that had the same sexual orientation as me. Uh, the world of coming out on top is mostly free of discrimination and social injustices. So while on one side, some people could argue that it's this very optimistic world that is, almost this abstract, ahistorical, and apolitical vision of utopia, I would argue on the other hand that coming out on top can be read in light of radical hope. So I'll read this quote. Radical hope is not so much something you have, but something you practice. It demands flexibility, openness, and what Lear describes as imaginative excellence. Radical hope is our best weapon against despair, even when despair seems justifiable. It makes the survival of the end of your world possible. Only radical hope could have imagined people like us into existence. So, end of the quote. And so, slightly modifying Braden Schaffer reflection on Dream Daddy, I would stress that the comic and fun world of coming out on top exposes in a certain way social injustices by removing them from its world and making them seem out of place, absurd, upon the player's return to the real world. So I think that video games are not only site for ideological reproduction, but also for critical thinking and can be used to reflect on the kind of world we want to live in. The positive experiences that many players had with the game and the fact that they wanted to share these experiences online are a strong reminders that players are willing to take this creative opportunity and to hope for a better future. So I have some more pictures here, the bibliography, and I guess we don't have time for questions, but anyways, if you want to send me questions, I'm very happy to answer. I put my email there, and you can also check out the full paper, 2021, hopefully. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Samuel. Thank you a lot. It's really a pity that we don't have time for questions.